And good morning once again, my brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. How thankful I am to God that we are gathered again to look into the book. And today, we're just going to cover one verse, but it's such a pivotal verse. I would tell you, if you could memorize a verse to help you get through life, this might be the verse to land on in terms of living your life every day to serve Jesus Christ faithfully. Let me show you what I'm talking about this morning. 1 Corinthians 10:13. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it. Now, to get a full perspective here, let's go back to where we are in the book. Remember, 1 Corinthians 9 ended with Paul saying, look, I'm running a race. I'm willing to give up my rights when it comes to presenting the gospel to other people, but I don't want to be disqualified. I want to live well. In chapter 10, he talked about how the Israelites had every advantage, but they wouldn't be faithful to God. He told them, look, he told us, don't be idolaters. He said we should avoid that. We should avoid and not indulge in sexual immorality at all. In other words, he's been calling us to purity. He says, look, I don't want you to test God. You should not be in a position where you're pushing God. He says, do not grumble against God. And he gives all Old Testament illustrations and how God judges people based on these things that they do, and how many thousands of people died under the judgment of God because of their unwillingness to do what God has said. And he tells us, look, I want you to learn from these Old Testament examples of God's judgment. Pay attention to how God responds when we live in an evil, unbiblical, ungodly way. And he ended yesterday by telling us, look, therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. There's none of us that are able to just coast. We all have to pay attention to our lives and say, am I living in a way that honors God? Or am I committing idolatry by deciding I'm going to make God in my own image? He's going to have to conform to what I want. I'm not going to conform to what he wants. Am I indulging in sexual immorality? Any kind of sexual activity outside of a marriage between a man and a woman is sexual immorality in God's eyes. That's what he said. Our culture says, oh, don't worry about what God said. But that's exactly the devil's tactic, right? To tell us, don't worry about what God said. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus Christ, we have to all be absolutely worried about what God said, that we might obey him. All right. So we can't stand and think everything's fine. We have to continue to pay attention lest we be disqualified, lest we fall. All right, so now let's go back to the verse, 1 Corinthians 10:13. No temptation has overtaken you. Now we're going to break this down today. We're going to just look at this idea of temptation. I want to make a few clarifications here for you to help you understand what's being said. This word can be translated either temptation or trial. I want you to see, what is a temptation? Please note this. It is not a sin to be tempted. All right? To be confronted with a situation where you might decide that you're going to do something evil, or you might decide to reject that choice and follow God and walk in honor and integrity before God in obedience. To be confronted with that situation is not a sin in of itself. No, you might be tempted to steal that money. You might be tempted to tell that lie. You might be tempted to lust after that person, whatever the sin might be. But just because you're tempted to do it doesn't mean you've done it, all right? It's a test as long as you resist. Can you overcome the test? Well, in the verse we just read, yes, God's going to make us a way to get out of the temptation, but the temptation only becomes a sin when you and I fall to it, right? For Satan to say to Eve, look, why don't you eat that fruit God told you not to eat? Eve had the choice of saying no. Had she done that, she would have been tested by the devil and she would have passed the test. Instead, what did she do? She went after that fruit, she ate it. What happened? Well, she sinned. Sin only occurs if we yield to the temptation. That's the point. Now just think about the strength Jesus had in his own life, having never yielded. The temptation just grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, and he never gave into it. You see, once we give into the temptation, then we've sinned. Jesus never had that experience. I want you to think about temptation as like this. Temptation is the opportunity to disobey God, to do something God says don't do, or not do something that God says to do, in any way to disobey or dishonor God. That's temptation. The choice is ours. I take you to James quickly here to just think about this verse. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. In other words, we want something more than we want what God wants. We decide that money's worth it. We decide telling that lie is going to keep us out of that problem, or whatever it is. We are lured and enticed by our own desire, and then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth what? You see that? Sin, when it's fully grown, brings forth death. Sometimes I think we think of sin so casually. God always ties disobedience to God to death. The wages of sin is death. We've heard that over and over. But to be tempted is not to sin. The sin occurs when we yield to the temptation. So let's go back to the verse. No temptation has overtaken you. What's this about? Well, the idea here is that sin wants to control us. That to become a person that's hooked to some addictive behavior, hooked to some disobedience, you might play around with sin and think this or that is permissible, or nobody cares, I'm going to go against God in this way. What you find out in many cases is that sin owns you. In fact, look at the biblical evidence for that. In Genesis 4, do you remember Cain? This is when the first murder in the Bible is recorded. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your face fallen?" What happens? God tells him, look, if you do well, what does that mean? If you just obey me. All right, I said I didn't want the offering you offered, but I do want an offering from you. Just give me the offering that I've asked you to give me. If you do well, that's fine. Will you not be accepted? I'll be happy to receive you, Cain, if you'll come to me on my terms. And if you do not do well, pay attention, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. You must exercise your power to defeat sin in your life. Jesus said it this way. Jesus answered them in John 8, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin." That's a powerful truth, isn't it? That when we participate in doing evil, we are enslaving ourselves to that evil. Wow. So back to the verse. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. What are we being told? That everybody's tempted, that our sinful natures are lured away. We do want to live for ourselves. We do consider ourselves self-sufficient. We do think that we know more than God and that we don't have to obey him because we're going to do it like we want to do it. Okay, this is a common fallacy in the human heart. People are constantly saying, hey, why is the world such a messed up place? Because when you put several billion people together and every one of them is in it for themselves, how can you avoid conflict? How can you avoid strife and evil? It's part and parcel of the sinful condition we are in. It's not uncommon. Everybody has a sinful nature. But look what the verse goes on to tell us. God is faithful. Now we're going to shift from the evil that could come to us through our own behavior to the fact that God is strong enough, good enough, capable enough to do what? He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. Now that's a really profound truth right there. Just understand this. Whenever temptation comes to you, you always have the ability to overcome that temptation. There is nothing so overcoming that you cannot resist it. There is always a way out. God himself, the faithful one, will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. Wow. I mean, to me, that's just a phenomenal truth. When I sin, you know what that means? It means that I haven't drawn on the capacities that God has granted me. I have not gone to him and said, God, I really, really don't want to do evil today. I don't want to sin against you in any way. Please help me. Please show me what to do. Please give me the strength to resist. No, instead, I have cooperated with that desire or passion that has caused me to think about doing something evil, and I am moving towards it instead of rejecting it. God says, look, I'm faithful to you, and I'm not going to let you ever be tested or tempted beyond your ability. You always have a way out. And he says this, look, but with the temptation, whoops, I messed up. Oh, I just want to point this out before I move forward. Jesus lived this life. Jesus lived this life. He was here. He was tempted in every way. I just want you to see his example before we move on in the verse. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Once again, Jesus sets the example for us to say it is possible to live a life of obedience to God. Now, not that you and I will ever be perfect like Jesus is perfect, but the point is we cannot look at our temptation as, oh, it's inevitable that I'm going to fall today because I feel that temptation. No, we have to completely understand that God hates sin. God wants to give us the strength and the direction to keep us away from sin. It's up to us to say, God, please be my resource, be my strength, that I might not yield to temptation today. That's the point. Okay, now back to the verse. God's faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability. But with the temptation, what will God do when the test comes? He will also provide a way of escape. Do you see that? There's a way out. You know the implication to that, don't you? Run for it. Sometimes, remember Joseph in Genesis? When Potiphar's wife wants to sleep with him, what does he do? He leaves his coat in her hands and he runs. He flees temptation. God gave him a place to escape and he took it. You know, my fear for us is that when we do see the way to avoid temptation, we don't take it because of the alluring, enticing nature of sin. We would rather sin against God than run away from evil. How many of us like to live on the fence where we say, oh, I'm going to go to heaven, but I want to have as much fun and do as much dirt as I feel like doing here and now so I don't miss out on anything. Well, that's not how God looks at it at all. He wants us to be holy because he's holy. He wants us to live well before him in obedience. He's going to give us a way to escape temptation so that what? So that we can endure it, so that we can survive it and get through it. This is a critical verse for your understanding and mine. This is where God wants us to understand he has the power to help us overcome temptation. So how do we overcome temptation? Well, God provides a way of escape. That's how. But look at James. I go back to James 4. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. That's a critical first part of this verse. We are called to say, God, with all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, with all my strength, my goal today is to be under your direction, at your discretion. You show me where to go. Tell me the truth of your word. Let me find it in the book. I'm going to follow you. And when I see that I'm out of line, God, I'm going to get back in line to obey what you've taught me. I will submit myself to you. But look at the next part of this verse. Resist the devil. All right, so God tells me what? If I'm going to avoid temptation, he's going to make a way of escape. I can run for it. And he tells me in James, look, if I fight against the devil, when I get that temptation, if I say, no way, I will not submit myself to evil, I'm going to submit myself to God, the devil's going to run away from me. You see that? Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Do you understand the glorious power God's placed in us through his Spirit? We're told not to grieve the Spirit. We're told to walk in the Spirit. We have to take a strong stance when it comes to temptation and say, my heart is to serve Jesus well today through obedience. I will not yield to the temptation that I may face today. I pray by God's grace that you and I can keep 1 Corinthians 10:13 in our hearts and our minds, and that we can avoid falling to temptation. You're never going to avoid temptation. It's all around. But you can avoid falling. God's going to make a way of escape. He's going to make a way for us to endure it if we'll only respond correctly, asking him for help, resisting, and running for it if we have to. There's a lot more that we could say today, church, but I pray you get the point. Resist temptation. Stand. That's the point. God bless you, church. Serve him well today.